You know, for years, the story of Southern Europe's economy was, well, it was a story of crisis. But lately, that whole narrative has done a complete 180. So we're going to dig in and ask, is this comeback we're hearing about a genuine, honest-to-goodness boom? Or is it all just a mirage?
I mean, think about it. It wasn't that long ago that countries like Greece, Italy, Spain, and Portugal were called the problem children of Europe, practically drowning in debt. Now, you see headlines calling them the new growth engine of Europe. That is some serious whiplash. So the big question we're tackling today is, which one of these stories is the real one?
And it really is a surprising turnaround. Because while the old economic powerhouses, I'm talking about countries like Germany, are really struggling, the South is putting up some seriously impressive numbers. The tables have totally turned. Okay, so to really understand this whole debate, the boom versus the mirage, we have to rewind the clock. We need to look back at the crisis that basically defined the last 2 decades for this region. It all kicked off in the late 90s when the euro was introduced. All of a sudden, Southern European countries could borrow money at these incredibly cheap rates. And what followed was a massive, debt-fueled spending spree. But it was a bubble. And in 2008, that bubble burst spectacularly. That led straight into the Eurozone crisis, which meant EU bailouts, but they came with a huge catch: brutal austerity measures. We're talking painful cuts to public services that led to years and years of economic pain. That's the history everyone agrees on.
So with that context, let's start with the optimistic view. This is the case for a real comeback, and it's backed by some pretty strong economic data that points to an incredible recovery.
Just look at these growth numbers. In 2023, Spain's economy grew by 2.5%, Greece by 2.3%. Meanwhile, the average for the entire Eurozone was a measly 0.5%. They are just blowing past their northern neighbors. And it's not just about growth. You know, a huge criticism back in the day was that they weren't financially responsible. Well, today, these countries have really gotten their finances in order. They're now meeting, or in some cases even beating, the EU's super strict budget rules, which say your deficit has to stay below 3% of your GDP.
And you can see this turnaround so clearly right here. Countries like Greece and Portugal are actually running budget surpluses. Compare that to France, Europe's second biggest economy, which has a deficit over 5%. The so-called problem children are now, in many ways, more fiscally responsible than their old tutors.
So, what's going on here? Well, the folks who believe in the comeback story point to 4 main drivers. First, those really painful austerity years forced deep reforms that actually made their economies leaner and more prudent. Second, there's this massive €800 billion EU recovery fund, and a huge chunk of that money went to the South. Third, they just weren't as dependent on Russian gas, so the energy crisis didn't hit them nearly as hard. And finally, a powerful post-pandemic tourism boom is bringing in record amounts of cash. And look, if you need just one number to sum up this whole comeback case, it's this: Spain's economy grew 5 times faster than the Eurozone average last year. 5 times! It's kind of hard to argue with a number like that, right? Well, here's where the whole thing gets complicated. Because despite all this amazing data, there's a really strong counter-argument that says this comeback story, it just isn't real. Especially not if you ask the people who are actually living there.
And that brings us to the other side of the coin, the case for Mirage. This argument says that those booming numbers are totally misleading, and they're hiding a much more depressing reality.
And you can see the disconnect right away. While officials and newspapers are cheering on Spain's booming economy, a staggering 63% of the people who actually live in Spain believe the economy is doing badly or very badly. So, how can both of these things be true at the same time? Well, the skeptics argue that this so-called growth is really just propped up by 2 very specific things: a global, post-pandemic urge to travel and a massive wave of immigration. And as it turns out, both of these have some pretty big downsides.
Okay, let's start with tourism. Sure, it creates jobs, but what kind of jobs? They're often low-paid, they're seasonal, and they don't really offer much of a future. We're talking waiters, hotel staff. As one analyst put it, no country has ever gotten rich from tourism alone. It's not the foundation for a strong, modern economy.
Then you have immigration. This is pretty wild. In Spain, over the last 3 years, 9 out of every 10 new people entering the job market have been immigrants. They're filling millions of low-wage jobs that, frankly, many locals don't want, because you just can't survive on those salaries. And this gets us right to the heart of the Mirage argument. The headline GDP number might be going up, sure. The whole economic pie is getting bigger. But, and this is a huge but, Because so much of that growth is just from more people living there, the GDP per person is barely moving. So while the country looks richer on paper, the average person isn't actually getting a bigger slice of the pie.
And yeah, when you look past those flashy headlines, the same deep structural problems are all still there. Salaries haven't really budged in 20 years. Youth unemployment is sky high. Young, educated people are still leaving to find work elsewhere. And public services like healthcare and education are crumbling after years of those austerity cuts. I mean, get this, in Greece, real wages are still lower than they were before the 2008 crisis.
So where does that leave us? We have two totally different stories. One is this triumphant comeback, and the other is a really painful mirage. How on earth can both of these be true? And what does it all mean for the future?
This is where you see the puzzle laid out perfectly. The comeback view is absolutely correct. Headline GDP is up, deficits are down, investors feel good, but the Mirage view is also correct. That growth isn't trickling down. It's built on low-wage jobs, public services are struggling, and the average person is no better off. You have a healthy macroeconomic picture, but a really tough microeconomic reality for everyday people.
Ultimately, this whole debate really boils down to what we even mean by economic growth. I mean, the technical definition is just an increase in the value of all the stuff an economy produces. But the really important question, the one this whole story forces us to ask, is who actually benefits from that increase?
And that leaves us with this final, massive question. Is what we're seeing in Southern Europe a truly sustainable recovery? Something built on a new, solid foundation for the future? Or is it just a temporary boom, fueled by sunshine and cheap labor that's just papering over the same deep, unresolved problems they've had all along? The answer to that question is going to define the future for millions and millions of people.